And I think all of the claims that people have made, sometimes directly to you, that you are somehow like being dangerous with this, presentation of evidence is reflective of the disease centered model, right? Because they're acting like you're going around telling people with diabetes to stop taking insulin when it's much more like you're going around highlighting that, for example, if you're relying on alcohol to drown your sorrows, that might not be the best approach. Or at least you need to
Yeah.
be very lucid about what exactly is happening there. And you rightly point out in the book, we have the correct intuitions when we take other psychoactive substances like alcohol. We know what's happening. We understand we're not correcting anything. We're just inducing a state of mind that is a relief in some way, or it's preferable in some way. And so we know what's happening. But
Mm.
as as we're talking about, the problem with prescription psychiatric drugs is that people don't think of it in that way. So their intuition is thwarted and they think of it in this disease centered way, which leads them to think, I need this. This is this is crucial for my well-being, and it would be irresponsible to like suggest otherwise. So
Yeah,
thank you
absolutely.
for clarifying that.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Just if I could just add to that.
please.
Um, so you've put it really well. What I want people to do is really think very clearly about how the drugs affect them and what are the pros and cons of those effects. And there are some situations where I think taking a prescription psychiatric mind-altering drug is it is a good thing, is preferable to the mental turmoil that people are going through. So, for example, people who are undergoing an acute psychotic episode, I think, can be helped by taking an antipsychotic drug, although I don't believe that these are targeting anything specific in the way that their name suggests. They do induce a state of emotional numbness and emotional indifference. They slow down thinking altogether, and that can, for some people, enable them to distance themselves from their psychotic experiences and become less invested in them and less distressed by them. And so I think that's an example that antipsychotics don't always work in that situation. They're not always useful, but for some people, I think they are useful in that way, dampening down what's happening and allowing people to step back from it.
Yeah.
So there are some situations where I think drugs can be useful, but I think we need to think about them differently. And I would suggest this is a much more intelligent way of thinking about drugs. We need to really understand everything that they do and think about them very carefully rather than this, rather simplistic model that, you've got something that it's appealing because if it was true and the drugs, were perfect, I guess it would be a good thing. But,
Right.
it's overly
Sounds so
simplistic.
logical.
Yeah, yeah.
And what's so interesting is what you just described as the situation where it would make sense to prescribe a psychiatric drug. What you just described is such an extreme contrast from what I think is the most common scenario in which they are prescribed. We have, what's much more common than acute psychosis is the 16-year-old girl whose self-esteem is really low and doesn't feel like her friends really like her and doesn't get enough attention at home, things like that. Or the older man who's lonely and just doesn't speak to his friends and family much anymore. And we have all of these most common situations where people are prescribed psychiatric drugs that are really nothing like what you just described as a situation where it would make sense and be helpful.
Yeah. Yeah, and,
Um,
and and I think describing those situations also helps highlight one of the other adverse effects of antidepressants, which I think is really important, which is the psychological effect that they undermine people's ability or motivation to address their problems in a different way, and they reinforce this idea that we are powerless, that we're just a victim of our brain chemistry, and and there's not much that we can do about it. And there is evidence to show that, people who have absorbed this idea about having a chemical imbalance, for example, have worse outcomes and are less likely to believe that there's anything they can do to improve their situation. So I think, this idea that that mental health problems are biological brain disorders, and that you need psychiatric drugs to put them right is profoundly disempowering and can be really harmful and can, lower people's self-esteem even further in the long run. Even though sometimes people get a bit of a blip, a bit of a benefit from it, maybe initially, because they go and see the doctor at a low point. The doctor says, oh, this is what's happening. You've got this brain chemical imbalance. Here's an answer to it. And people think, oh, thank goodness, there's a nice, simple remedy for this situation. So initially people might feel a bit better. But then, of course, it's not as simple as that. They don't get better. Then, they think that they need another drug, or they think they've failed in some way. They failed to respond to the treatment. So it just actually compounds people's low self-esteem and lack of confidence in many cases, I believe.
That might be one of the most important points in this whole conversation, is the risk that the drug would undermine the capacity to actually solve the problems that the depression is stemming from.